Mrs Birling. In the opening stage directions, Sybil Birling is described as cold and as her husband's social superior. This is a pretty accurate summing up of her character, which doesn't really change very much by the play's end. She remains callous throughout and acts selfishly, without due regard for or care for others, believing that her status as an upper middle-class woman means that she is better than nearly everyone else in society. The fact that she cannot be shaken out of this conviction reflects Priestley's wider point that the older generation are stuck in their ways and so need to be rejected. Until this happens, society will remain unequal and unjust. Before the inspector arrives, Mrs Birling is largely a background figure, but it's clear that appearances are important to her. She chides her husband for the minor faux pas of complimenting the chef and expresses her disapproval over Sheila's use of slang. Later, when she encounters the inspector, she acts in a high-handed manner, prompting Sheila to warn her that she's starting off wrong. Naturally, Mrs Birling ignores her daughter and continues to act in a superior manner, confident in her position of privilege and wealth. Even Gerald isn't immune from Mrs Birling's judgment. She labels Gerald's affair with Eva as disgusting, making her disapproval clear. Therefore, it's not surprising that when it comes to her turn to be questioned, Mrs Birling is uncooperative and resists the inspector's questioning, forcing him to be more direct and assertive. Eventually, Mrs Birling relents and admits to her involvement in turning down the pregnant Eva's application for charity from her committee. Even so, she remains unrepentant and conveys a heartless disregard for Eva, which demonstrates her lack of empathy and class prejudice. She disparagingly dismisses Eva as a girl of that sort and believes that Eva is inferior and unworthy of compassion as a result. In the end, she is hoisted by her own petard, as she condemns the father of Eva's unborn child as the chief culprit who should be made a public example of, before belatedly realising that the father is Eric. Mrs Birling's inflexibility and pride prove to be her undoing. Her hypocrisy is also on show for all to see. Another aspect of Mrs Birling's ignorance is depicted through her emotional distance from her family, particularly Eric. She is genuinely surprised about Eric's heavy drinking, which has been plain to see for some time, since Sheila and Gerald are both aware that he drinks too much, and is stunned by Eric's sex life and criminal behaviour in stealing money from the office. Ironically, she declares that she is ashamed of her son, overlooking her own damning failings. After the inspector leaves, Mrs Birling, like her husband and Gerald, eagerly seizes on the revelation that the inspector was a fake, believing that this means that things can now return to normal, and that there's no lesson for her to learn, if indeed she ever did think this. Here, she markedly contrasts with her children, who are appalled by both their parents' attitudes, marking a clear division between the generations within the Birling family. Indeed, by the play's end, Mrs Birling loses any influence over Sheila and Eric, who are in open revolt against their parents, refusing to do as they are told. Like Mr Birling and Gerald, Mrs Birling is a hopeless case who is too set in her ways. Overprivileged people like Mrs Birling, who are narrow-minded and socially conservative, are presented as obstacles to social progress. Priestley argues through the play that these out-of-date viewpoints need to be rejected in favour of more progressive, open-minded attitudes as symbolised by the younger characters at the play's end.